Welcome to Module 3. In this video, I'm going to talk about language development, which is the key focus of this module. Most of the content I'll be covering is going to come from our McAndrews text, literacy assessment, and metacognitive strategies. So to start, we have to talk about what language is. Language, of course, is a key element to language development. And language is a complex and dynamic system of conventional sounds and symbols for thinking and communicating in spoken, written, and or visual modes by people of a particular community. And that last piece is pretty important. That's the social cultural context related to language. So it's not enough that there is this system of agreed upon sounds and symbols that we use to communicate, but the particular community. You know this because you can't necessarily go anywhere in the world and understand their system. You have to be a part of that culture, a part of that community of speakers. Humans use language to understand the world around them and to connect with others within it. That's kind of the whole point of language. We don't speak and learn language to speak into a vacuum. We speak to one another. We communicate. We use it to connect with other people. There are, according to our text, 4 types of communication. We've got verbal, which of course is what you do when you're speaking. It's that speaking voice. You're also actively listening. What you see over here is actually from that website, Indeed, which is where you can go if you want to get a job. And I thought this was interesting because in a quick Google search, I found these types of communication. Indeed is using them to talk about how this can help you to get a job. So in that verbal communication area, things like avoiding filler words. Those are words like and oh and any kind of filler. Like, you hear a lot of likes out there. I just said Whenever I'm talking about filler words, I always seem to slip a filler word in there. And then, of course, jargon. This can happen in the field of education. We're a very acronym and jargon and academic language-driven field. So think about that as you're communicating. The second one is nonverbal. This is things like your hand motions, the way that your face looks, your body language. And Indeed says, notice how your emotions feel physically. So when you're angry or nervous, are you tensing up? Are you clenching your fists? Be intentional about your nonverbal communications and mimic the nonverbal communications that you find effective. Same can be said for teachers and maybe students. The next one is written, and this is obviously the communication that we use when we are writing, when we are texting, when we are emailing, when we are posting to our social media. And Indeed says to strive for simplicity and don't rely on tone. So there is something in that written piece, actually in all of these forms of communication, tone, the tone that you use. We're going to talk about that more as we move through. The last form of communication is visual. And this could be lots of different things, but the way that you appear to other people, if you are creating something, the visual creation that you have. If you are writing a paper or putting together a presentation, you might include visuals in that. If you're teaching, you might have lots of visuals, particularly for your students who are learning to speak English as a new language. So those are our 4 types of communication according to our text. We've also got language systems that exist, and we're going to spend the rest of the slides kind of talking through these. This image that I found, it's coming from the American Speech and Hearing Association website, but it's got an extra one here, phonetics, which is simply speech sounds. So I'm going to go through all of these one by one and talk about them. So the first system is called the phonological system, and this is the system that's responsible for recognizing distinct speech sounds heard in language. Whenever you see phonological, think phone, think listening. It's all about what you hear. We're only talking about the things that you can hear here. So a couple terms you need to know here. Phoneme. A phoneme is the smallest unit of sound in speech. That is like the, in the word cat, you're going to hear k, a, t, 3 different phonemes that stand together to make up that word. Along with that is something called phonological awareness. And this is what you must have if you are going to be a successful reader. And it's the knowledge that language is made up of sounds. It seems very simple, but this can be a really tough hurdle for some emergent readers to get over. They need to know that the word cat has phonemes in it, and those phonemes together make up language. This is what babies are doing when they're listening to their parents and their siblings and those around them speak. They're starting to understand that it's not just like Charlie Brown's parents, want, want, want. There's actually, maybe it's not Charlie Brown's parents. Maybe it's the Muppet Babies. That's it. The Muppet Babies' parents. It's not just want, want, want in their ears. Those sounds actually produce communication for us. And once you understand that and can start to manipulate those sounds, which is something called phonemic awareness, we will focus an entire module next week on that. Once you are able to start to do that, then you emerge in your ability to be able to read. These are foundational skills that have to happen first before you can go into reading. Articulation is another word that you should know, and this is producing speech sounds in the mouth and in your throat. And there are 44 sounds in English. We will go through all of these in a later module. To note, young children below the age of 8 often have difficulties in articulation and speech. Things like omitting, substituting, distorting sounds. This is when you hear a child say, "wabbit." That does not mean that they have a learning need in this area. This does not mean that they have a learning disability. It simply means that they are probably developmentally appropriately progressing through the stages of phonology, phonological awareness. Over here on the right is a illustration that I really like. It comes from Teach Magically, the website, but it shows you all of the skills that exist underneath phonological awareness. So this is sort of the umbrella category, and underneath that we have things like recognizing that words make up sentences, that words can be broken down into their individual syllables. You'll see teachers clapping out the syllables and words. That's a skill that is underneath phonological awareness. Onset and rhyme is breaking the words into their initial consonant sound and the vowel chunk that follows. So in the word cat, you've got k as the onset, at as the rhyme, and we can only do this at the syllable level. So every syllable you can do onset and rhyme, and children have to learn this. Rhyming and alliteration, you probably remember this from your English classes. If not, alliteration is when all of the first letters of the words in the sentence are the same, like she sells seashells down by the seashore. Phonemic awareness, we're going to spend a whole module on that. I will save that for later, but underneath phonemic awareness are things like blending, segmenting, adding, deleting, substituting phonemes, and then isolation. So we will return to this part of the umbrella very soon. Throughout my slides this semester, you're going to see these yellow slides with the diversity hands on the side. And it will always say DEI note. This is where I want to draw your attention to some of our anti-bias, anti-racist, diversity, equity, and inclusion elements of this class. Because along with a course where you are going to be asked to assess a student's ability in this module, for example, in language development, you've got to be aware of the ways that bias can sneak in, the ways that underrepresented or minority people and students of color have been marginalized by assessments in these areas. And so these slides are little reminders for you of the things that you might encounter. And we'll talk more about how to handle these things as the semester rolls on. So this note related to phonological awareness says, not all substitutions and omissions in speech are errors. Some may be related to a feature of a dialect or an accent. Also, we just talked about on the last slide how it could be related to child development. So a child in first grade who says, "look at the wabbit," that student doesn't necessarily need have something wrong with them and need intensive intervention. It's developmentally appropriate for a kindergarten and first grader to say, look at the wabbit. They will get there. They will develop. They might need a little more support from you, but it doesn't mean that they have something quote unquote wrong with them. Same thing for example, speakers of African American vernacular English, or I've heard it affectionately called Ave, and I love that. I might call it Ave all semester. Speakers of Ave may substitute, for example, the D sound D for the TH sound the in words like this. They might say dis, or though, they might say do. This does not mean that it's wrong. It shouldn't be counted as an error. These are phonological features of that particular dialect. The same thing might happen for students who are learning English as a new language and are speaking accented English. They might have different pronunciations of things. It does not mean that it's wrong. And when you hear this in assessment, you should certainly make note of it. Student uses African American vernacular pronunciations of the TH sound as D. Make note of that. That goes in your notes in your observations column, but it should not be marked as incorrect. So if you find yourself this semester giving a student an assessment and you hear this sound and you suspect that they speak African American vernacular English, you want to double check that, confirm, ask some questions, reach out to the teacher, and you shouldn't be marking those things as incorrect. So this slide is showing you what I expect you to do in this class, and this comes from our textbook, when you are transcribing a student's speech. So transcribing means you're writing down exactly what the student says verbatim, and you're going to have to do that a few times in this class throughout the various assessments you'll be giving. So if they pronounce the word correctly, you're going to just use normal spelling. If they pronounce the word incorrectly, I'd like you to use phonetic spelling to show what the student said. This doesn't have to be, our textbook mentioned the International Phonological Association spelling. It doesn't have to be perfect in that system, but generally I want you to note things like, and this slide, because it's helpful, is copy and pastable. So if you hear long vowels in words and you want to emphasize that the student use long vowel A, you can come and grab the long vowel symbol here, which is just an A with a line over the top. And I did this in Arial font, which is pretty typical of what you might use for your papers and your work. Short vowel is going to have a little mark like that. The schwa sound, which we will talk about when we do our next module. All of these will make sense to you. If you're like, oh man, what's a long vowel? What's a short vowel? We're going to go over all of that in the next module. Do not worry. I just wanted to show you the marking system here because it came up in this chapter of our text. So if the word that the student read, for example, was want, but the student said ent, you would transcribe it or write it as W in between the lines. That shows the student said ooh, and then ent with the short vowel sound, like you hear in ent, short E. So that's how you'll transcribe this semester. And I'll bring this back up as we need it, as it's relevant. Another DEI note here before we leave the phonological system, accents and dialects can also impact the way that someone pronounces a word. So not only will they substitute a sound or maybe omit a sound if they speak, for example, ave, but they might actually pronounce a sound differently. For example, in the word mouth, you might hear someone who speaks ave say mouth, or ask, you might hear them say axe instead. This does not mean that it is incorrect. If you mark ask pronounced as axe, incorrect, I'm going to call you on it every single time. The bottom line here is that teachers should get to know their students, and that's step one of this class, is getting to know your focus student. You should get to know the dialect or the accent that's spoken at home, and you should never correct them on it. If a student in your class says axe, you're not going to correct them and say you're pronouncing it wrong. It is ask. The S comes before the K. That is part of their home language. their cultural identity, because language, according to Jim G, is closely connected to your culture. And Jim G is a researcher on discourse and discourse analysis across cultures. So we're not going to correct that in our students. We're not going to tell them that it's wrong. We're not going to mark it wrong on our assessments. We're going to mark it and make note of it in the column that says observations or notes, like every assessment should. You're going to make note of it. Student speaks African American vernacular English. Pronounce the word mouth as mouth. You'll make note of it and you'll move on. Does not mean they need intervention or they need a lesson on how to pronounce the TH sound. No, we don't want to change the way that they speak at home. We want to honor and recognize and accept it in our schools. This is part of our inclusive programs here. Okay, so this is just a note. This was just a really quick snapshot about phonology and phonemic awareness. We have a whole module focused on just these concepts that I just went over in module 4. Look forward to that. Okay, we'll move a little bit quicker through these next ones. The morphological system is next, and this is the system responsible for analyzing the structure of words and word parts. This is like the structure of all of the words that we have. They all come from an origin, they all come from a place. They can all be rooted back to somewhere in the English language. And part of that is understanding morphemes, which are the smallest unit of grammatical meaning in a language. So some morphemes you can see are in these word maps over here. So N, over, joy, able, the ED ending, the ING ending, ject, all of these prefixes, all of these suffixes. So root words, prefixes, suffixes, those are all morphemes. And together, they get pieced together and build the words that we speak, that we then build together to build the sentences, the paragraphs, et cetera, and we have our language. Studying the origins of words and their bases or roots can help teachers to understand student errors or difficulties, especially when it comes to cognates to the English language learner's home language. Now, a cognate is words that are similar across languages, like the word no in Spanish is the same as the word no in English. A very simple example. Those are cognates, or words that are derivative from other languages. Those are cognates. We will talk more about this as we focus on our words their way spelling content later this semester as we talk about word study and spelling. A DEI note here, some vernaculars or dialects of English have purposeful and rule-bound differences in their morphological system. This does not mean that they have a deficit in their understanding of morphology. You hear this in certain dialects of Southern English or in African American vernacular English. For example, in Ave, sometimes they don't inflect the ends of words, especially when it ends in S or ED. So you might hear them say, I'm at my sister house. This isn't incorrect. This is how morphologically that dialect of English is spoken. Notice that the S would be left off of the possessive, my sister's house. I'm at my sister's house. Speakers of Ave would understand that that is correct. That is showing possession. That's a morphological change that is made often in that language. That's not incorrect. It's just different. So I want you to start to flex in your mind instead of thinking deficit. That's bad, that's wrong, that's not right. Keep in mind that the systems of language that exist come from the dominant culture, the dominant people within a culture. So standard American English, which by the way, I hate the name standard American English because it implies that everything else that exists within that, regional dialects, accents, different morphologies of English, is not standard. And that just has a negative connotation to it. I haven't come up with a better way of calling it, so we'll call it standard American English in this class this semester. But just know that that phrase alone has some tension for me. It doesn't sit well. But these types of differences, these different morphological structures to languages, to vernaculars or dialects that exist within standard American English, they are not incorrect. Instead, they are different. They sit alone by themselves as rule-bound, purposeful systems of language. And if you're interested in this topic, I have a resource here from hawaii.edu that actually shows you some of the rules and structures that African American vernacular English actually follows. And there are some who even say that Ave as a name is not favored by some speakers of this dialect. They prefer, you'll see up here, they call it Ebonics or Black English or Black English Vernacular or Vernacular Black English. I'm going to call it Ave because that's what I've seen in a lot of the research that I've been reading to prep for this semester. We can talk about this in class if in our in-person class, if folks would like to talk about what to call this language structure. But anyway, you can see this website lays out the grammar of how Ebonics or African American Vernacular English is spoken. You can see how they handle the past tense. The TH sound is in here that we've already talked about. Vowels, nasalized vowels, diphthongs, which you'll learn about in the next module. The grammar, the verb to be, because that is a very interesting one in Ave, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So this website has a lot of information. If you are very unfamiliar with African American vernacular English, you haven't heard a whole lot of people speaking it, you don't have friends or people in your everyday life who speak Ave, you will hear it in the schools when you go out for field placements or student teaching. You should read this website. You should read through and find videos to learn a little bit more about this vernacular of English. It's very common in the Rochester area. You'll hear lots of students speaking this if you're in the city district. So I encourage you, if you are unfamiliar with this, it is your job to prepare yourself for what you're going to hear. So read through this website. There's tons of resources online, and see if you can find some videos of people speaking Ave so that you're ready and you know what you can expect. The next one is called the Syntactic System. This is the system that's responsible for the rules of our word order, the rules of our sentence structure, grammar. This is the system responsible for grammar. This includes understanding the parts of speech. Notice, I'm not saying naming them. Like most speakers of a language can't tell you, I'm using the past participle or the subjunctive form of the verb to be. We can't usually name that unless we have studied it and we're grammarians, but generally we can't name them, but we know how to use them. And we know when it sounds funny or when someone has said something that doesn't align with the syntactic system. Kids do this all the time when they're reading. Even though they don't know the parts of speech and can name them, if they don't know a word and they get to it, they can usually sub in a word that fits grammatically correctly and will sound right. This includes verb tenses and pluralizing nouns, which are sometimes tricky for kids. And for children learning English as a new language, they might sometimes use the grammar of their home language. So for example, in Spanish, the way that they do subject and verb and adjective or noun and adjective is a little bit different. It's a little bit reversed. It's a little bit different from the way we speak English. So for example, in translated Spanish to English, they might say the book is in the table of the kitchen instead of the book is on the kitchen table. So table of the kitchen is a common phrase or how they would phrase it in Spanish. And I'm not a great Spanish speaker, so if someone in this class is and wants to talk more about this in class when we're in person, I would love that. So this chart is showing you the grammatical morphemes in chronological order of how they are typically learned by children. So for example, we learn present progressive, which is the ing form of a verb typically. We learn that first. So baby crying is an example of what you might hear. If you've got a toddler learning to speak and there's an infant in the house and the infant's crying, the toddler might say baby crying. That would make sense in developmental progression. Then they start to learn in and on. So juice in cup or book on table, they'll learn those prepositions. Then plural regular S, daddy have tools. So they start to learn when there's more than one thing. I put an S on the end, and sometimes that can get interesting. If, for example, the word fish, they might say fishes or fishies. Then they learn past irregular, like the doggy ate bone. They will learn past tense. And then possessives like Jake's apples, or they'll start to learn instead of just saying me apples or my apples, they'll use possessive correctly with the apostrophe S. Uncontractable copula. So copula is simply a fancy word for the verb to be. So if you can conjugate the verb to be correctly, you have mastered copula. So this is mine instead of this mine, or it mine. In children, that's pretty common. They'll skip that verb, but that is next. And then we've got articles, a and the, past irregular, he jumped, third person regular, Susie drinks, third person irregular, baby does, kitty has. Those are tricky verbs to conjugate. And then on up from there. So this can help you get a sense of how children develop through the syntactic system. Please note, some vernaculars or dialects have purposeful rule-bound differences in their syntax system as well. This doesn't mean they have a deficit. It means it is different. So once again, this is just like the morphological system. Speakers of African American vernacular English don't often use a copula for the verb to be. That is, they don't conjugate the verb to be, or they leave it out, or they change its use. They do many interesting things with the verb to be. A lot of them have a specific purpose, and a lot of it is to simplify the language. So you might hear someone say he all right instead of he is all right, leaving out that is. You might hear someone say they be looking for you instead of they are looking for you. So in the first example, they just leave the copula right out. In the second example, they change it and they use that be form of to be very frequently. And they might even change it to say, we been new. So we been new is a very common expression you might hear in Ave, and it just means we already knew. So if you hear, meaning a group of people already knew something. So if you hear we been new, it's pretty common and it means all of us already knew that. All of this is to say, this is not incorrect. If you hear children speaking this kind of vernacular in English, it is your job to learn more about it, to discover some of the rules that bound this system of language, and to accept it in your classroom. You don't need to change the way that someone speaks in your classroom. Here's another linguistic features of Ave. This is another website that's going to go a little bit in more detail about some of the things that we're talking about here. So we gonna go swimming, he don't know what he doing, where's she going? These are things that you'll hear in Ave, and it doesn't mean that it's wrong. So I always think of it this way. Can I understand, first of all, what the person is communicating? Absolutely, I can understand all of these sentiments. And I forgot what the other thing I was going to say was, but that's really the gist of it. Can you still understand what is being said? Oh, and does it still follow some sort of system of rules? Yes, it does. These are ways that you will commonly hear people. In fact, people have written books on the system of African American vernacular English. So it exists as a very commonly spoken dialect of English, vernacular of English. And instead of trying to change the way that your students speak, I want you to learn more about it. And I want you to think about it as another culturally rich way of communicating that a group of people have developed over time. Okay, the next one is the semantic system. This one's the system responsible for knowing the meaning of words, phrases, sentences, and longer passages. So where a lot of the other stuff has focused on like the grammar or the formation of words, this one is really looking at meaning, including understanding connotations of words like double meaning. So if we're going to table something, that's different from put that on the table, which is also different from I made a table in my paper. That's got triple meaning, as well as denotation, which is the dictionary definition of a word. Generally speaking, most people agree that there are three tiers of vocabulary that all people know. You've got your academic vocabulary at the top. That's really the specific discipline-driven kind of words that only experts in that field will know. So for example, isotope, peninsula, equilateral, those are words that are discipline driven. And if you are not in science or math, you might not maybe understand those words if you're not super familiar with those fields. High frequency words are your tier 2 words. Below that, that's your mature vocabulary, the everyday language that we use, but also like one step up from that, words that I think of these as like words that smart people use, because it's like absurd, scrumptious, philanthropist. They're a little bit higher than the everyday back and forth words, which are tier 3, your basic vocabulary: clock, teacher, baseball, cat, dog, hat, sat, said. Most of our sight words, most of the words that you're going to teach your elementary students is going to be basic vocabulary. By the time you get up to grades 4, 5, 6, middle school, you're moving into that mature vocabulary, and then of course going up to your academic vocabulary. That is not to say that there are not children in the world working at that tier 3 level who also have a tier 1 understanding of certain words. I had a student in my class who loved dinosaurs. He could tell me everything about dinosaurs, the era that they were on the earth, the different kinds of dinosaurs, like so many dinosaur words that I don't even know as a grown mature adult. He had a tier 1 level of vocabulary for dinosaurs. This semantic system also includes discourse, and discourse is how we talk. So not just understanding the meaning, but understanding how we talk. This is things like understanding jokes and humor in talking, and also learning how to talk in school and how to be in school. The school routines, if the teacher says, class, 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 students who know the routine are going to say, yes, yes, yes. Or if the teacher says, 1, 2, 3, eyes on me, the class will say 1, 2, eyes on you. Those are talk routines that the students have learned by being in school. Can you imagine coming in a couple months into school to a classroom that's already got these routines set and hearing them happen and feeling a little lost and a little scared? Or not speaking English as your first language and being in a class that has those routines established and feeling like very unsure about what they mean and what they're doing. Another thing here is talk moves. So talk moves are can cross cultural lines and can be a little bit confusing. So typically in white mainstream culture, I take a turn talking, I'm done talking, you take a turn talking, I listen, you're done talking, I might take another turn talking, or someone else might. In a classroom, we raise hands, teacher calls on, they speak, teacher responds. That's the typical talk moves that take place in a white mainstream classroom. This doesn't always jive well with cultures that do something like cross-talking or co-talking. For example, in African-American vernacular English, they often will speak at the same time or speak in a very oratory sense, like storytelling, these grand overtures as they're speaking. That doesn't always jive in school. So if the teacher's speaking and the student is excitedly trying to jump in, and at home, that's a very typical speech pattern or talk move, that teacher might go, oh, stop talking over me, and yell at the student for a kind of talk move that is pretty commonplace at home. So once again, I feel like a broken record. Get to know your students, get to know their backgrounds, understand what the culture is at home so that you can help them to understand the class culture. And that can be something as simple as a conversation about culture, how you talk at home, how you talk in school, and here's how I need you to talk when we're doing a small group, because if you're speaking at the same time as me, maybe your classmates can't hear me and understand. So I'm gonna ask that you listen while I'm talking, like helping them to understand this is the discourse that I want you to use in school. So this is sort of getting into what's on this slide, that children from non-mainstream backgrounds don't necessarily, oh, this is about vocabulary, don't necessarily know fewer words, but the kinds of words they know might not be recognized or used in schools. So when I was doing research for this slide, I was going to put on here the research on the 30 million word gap, which is a seminal study from, I think, the 70s. These researchers followed a bunch of children home, maybe 50 kids home, and listened to all the language that was spoken in their home, and found that kids from affluent families had, by the time they reached like age 4 or 5, had like 30 million more words in their vocabulary than their lower SES counterparts, socioeconomic status, so their poor counterparts, peers. This study has actually been kind of debunked, I just found, and it's interesting because I've taught that study for the last 7 years, and this was the first time I found people actually try to replicate the study and found that, in fact, students who come from non-mainstream, non-white backgrounds, they speak and know just as many words, but they might not be recognized in school, they might not be used in school, or they might relate to something cultural that maybe researchers who ran the initial study didn't understand or didn't recognize or pick up on. Lots of different reasons. So that 30 million word gap they found is actually more like a 4 million word gap, which doesn't seem as bad. So I just wanted to talk about that for a moment. This is Lisa Delpit, who is a key researcher on talk, and her book, Other People's Children, is just a foundational text on white people teaching Black children. And it's very interesting. She talks about poverty, but she hits a lot on discourse and the kinds of language that we teach our children in schools. And she talks a little bit about this next point about kids who are unfamiliar with academic vocabulary and talk patterns, or those who come in with different oral patterns. They might feel intimidated or lost in school talk, especially if they have a teacher who is unaware of the kinds of discourse that happen at their homes. So Delpit says, it is a teacher's job to understand these differences and to work to support students in learning a school discourse while honoring a home discourse too. So what's interesting about Lisa Delpit, she is a researcher of color. She doesn't say necessarily, we have to accept African-American vernacular English. We need to, make sure that everyone can speak Ave. She doesn't say that necessarily. She says more that teachers need to help their students understand the different kinds of language that exist, when to use them, how to use them, and what that use looks like. Which brings us nicely to the pragmatic system, which is the system of knowing the many functions of language that we use. These are our language choices within specific contexts, which is also called our registers. We have lots of different registers we use when we speak. This is talking about our discourse analysis of communication, our ability to look at a situation, assess the kind of language that's being spoken, and then change our language to fit in with the way that people are speaking. And people who have been exposed to lots of different kinds of registers are able to do this effectively and pretty easily. Dialects can impact pronunciation, syntax, and yes, even your word choice, and teachers have to distinguish mistakes in speech and reading that affect comprehension from those that don't. So the pragmatic system of language, here's just a nice diagram of it, is how language is used when we're communicating. This includes the social, the emotional, the communicative aspects of language. This starts well before the first words are spoken, in the way that interactions occur between people in the home environment, the parents, the caregivers, the gestures that are used, the way that people in the household respond to the children babbling. And this develops as we learn words and how to make sentences to converse with others. So there's some tips down here for our pragmatics of children aged 5 to 11, which is the coverage of this course. A DEI note here. Children who do not have access to the formal register is the generally very white-centric kind of talking that happens in schools and is accepted across academic circles. Kids who don't have access to that need to be taught that formal register so that they can compete for scholarships, for jobs, and other opportunities. This is what Lisa Delpit talks about in that article and in her work, Other People's Children. Some students even learn to do something called code switching. And if you go out here, it's going to take you to the Cult of Pedagogy, which is an amazing website for teachers. And it will explain all about what code switching is. But this diagram does a pretty good job of it. So in this picture, the girl says, or the student says, so I don't got no pencil, but you might could give me yours, which is African-American vernacular English. You might could give me yours, in the setting on the bench outside with a friend. In the school setting, the same student says, I told him I didn't have a pencil, and then I asked if I could borrow his. It's the same exact semantics, meaning it means exactly the same, but pragmatically and syntactically, grammatically, it's different the way that it's spoken. And this is code switching. The same person is able to speak in two different registers in two different settings. This website goes on to talk a little bit more about code switching, and in some of the further reading, NPR has a great program called Code Switch. It's got some other resources, and here's where I found that interview with Lisa Delpit on her book, Other People's Children. So teachers, again, should familiarize themselves with the various dialects and registers that families speak in their classroom and should welcome them. Teachers should not try to speak the dialect that is not theirs. This is something that you sometimes will see social media posts about this, people trying to appropriating someone else's dialect or registers. In my research for these slides, I found an interesting website that was like, all of the things that came from Black people, African-American vernacular English that white people have appropriated. Things like saying, bye Felicia, or I'm here for it, or even like 100%, or the clap emoji between the words in your texting or social media. These are things that are appropriated from Black people on the internet. So that was eye-opening for me. If people are interested in seeing that, I can share it. And the message was, don't use those expressions or those terms anymore, because you sound like a white person trying to sound like a Black person. The last point here, children who use different dialects should not be considered wrong or incorrect in their assessment when you're looking at pragmatics. So if you've asked a child to tell you a story or to repeat a story that they listened to assess their ability to recall information, and they use a different register than the one you're used to, don't assume that it's wrong. Assume that you have some learning to do. And teachers should always ask clarifying questions. If you think something is showing up in your assessment because of a dialect, a vernacular, a register, or a different morphological structure of a language that's spoken at home, you should do more research to clarify and find out if that is the case, or if that student actually missed that point and does, in fact, need some academic support. Okay, so this ends my first micro lecture. This is what you can expect in this class. I'll have a set of slides that are available in our Google Drive folder, and I'll kind of walk through the slides that are related to our text, but also bringing in some other stories and some other resources. And you can take anything that you see in these slides and dig deeper. Anything that I talked about is also fair game for discussion as we move into our face-to-face class on Thursday. Okay, everyone, this has been language development.